I don't know about you, but I have enjoyed this teaching series, Relationship Goals. We're in our fourth and final week of Relationship Goals, and we're talking about faithless or faithful. What does it look like to honor God in the midst of our relationships? And it's a difficult thing to do because sometimes life gets scary. It comes at you hard and fast, and you have to make choices. And you think the best choice to make is one thing, when in reality it betrays God's faith and his trust and the hope that he's placed in you. And it puts other people in bad situations when we make decisions that aren't fully thought through and aren't fully thought of. And so today I want to look at a story. We've been looking at these four different individual marriages through the Old Testament. Today I want to look at the story of a man named Abraham and his wife Sarah. Now, if you know anything about the story of Abraham and Sarah, you know that their lives started out where his name was Abram and her name was Sarai, and then God does a new work inside of them and calls them his own, and then changes their name to give them a new, fresh start, a new beginning. In fact, if you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, starting at verses 1 and 2, the Lord shows up to Abram and he says, leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. And so he gives him a calling, but it's a very interesting calling. He doesn't explain to him everything that's going to happen or how it's going to play out or what it's going to look like. And he says, and I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you. And the idea is if you're obedient, if you follow me, if you go where I lead you, that I'll be a blessing to you and I'll help you. And he says, I'll make your name great. You yourself will be a blessing. And so what he's saying to him is that if you follow me, if you are faithful, not only will I bless you, but you will become a blessing to others. Not only if you work to make my name famous, in the process, I'll make your name famous. And so he moves him from this position of being Abram and his wife Sarai to Abraham and Sarah, and he begins to do this work inside of him. But the problem is along the journey, like so many of us, we lose sight of that God has promised us, what he's called us to, where he's led us. And so a season that started off as very faithful winds up being a season filled with faithlessness. And so I don't know where you are right now. I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know if you have some stuff that's caused you, the circumstances of this last year and coming into 2021 and it being exactly the same as 2020. Maybe it's making you to be in a season of faithlessness. But I really want to challenge you, because what happens to us in faithless seasons is very damaging and it's harder to overcome. And so to be careful in the seasons where your faith is weak, to not allow too much negativity to take up residence inside of you. In fact, here's some things, if you're taking notes, I'm going to give you 3 of them today. Here's some dangerous things that can happen in seasons of faithlessness. And that's first and foremost is that you fall victim to fear. Now remember, God tells Abram, as he's shifting who he is and begins to do a work in his life, he sends him on a journey and he says, just follow me. That's all I'm asking for you to do, is to follow me. Have faith in me, follow me. I'll bless you and I'll make you a blessing. I'll give you a name that transcends time and space. You'll be the father of many, many nations. You're going to be amazing. It's going to be powerful. It's going to be wonderful. And so as Abraham's following him, they're about to enter into Egypt. And he says to his wife, Sarai, he says, I know what a beautiful woman you are. What a wonderful thing to say to your wife. What a beautiful woman you are, right? When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife? And then they will kill me and let you live. Now, that took a sideways turn real quick, didn't it? He says, man, you're gorgeous, babe. But when we get to Egypt, they're probably going to kill me and take you for their own. Now, what if you say, you're my sister, verse 13? So that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. And so what's happening is God tells him, take your wife, leave your father's land, go, leave your old life, and go where I lead you. Follow me, be faithful, and I'll be faithful to you. And I'll bless you, and you'll become a blessing to the nations. But you need to be obedient. You need to be faithful, and you need to follow me. That faithful following was the secret to him becoming the blessing, right? To be blessed and becoming the blessing. But what happens is he hits a season of faithlessness where fear starts to cause him to make a terrible decision. And when you start to make decisions that are fear-based decisions, not only do you mess things up, but sometimes you can make decisions where the timing for that decision isn't just right. And you can get ahead of God's plans and purposes, and you can get sideways and out from underneath his blessing. And that's the second one, if you're taking notes, that if you're not careful in faithless seasons, you can get ahead of what God's doing. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go and sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family for you through her." And so now God had plans to help Sarah to conceive, even though Abram was old and Sarah was old too. God had made plans to help them have a child, and for that child to be, the forefather of amazing people. Abraham, right, and would give birth to a son named Isaac, and then Isaac would give birth to a son named Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You heard a little bit about Jacob's story earlier in this series as we were together. And so they get ahead of God, and she says, I got an idea. How about you impregnate my maid, and then she can give you a child, and then that child can then become, at least an heir for you. I can't give you an heir, so then at least we can do this. And so she gets ahead of what God's doing. The problem is that when we get ahead of what God's doing, other people get left behind. We don't have the ability to look at a situation through time and space the way God does. We don't get to play chess with our lives. We don't have the ability to second and third guess the moves that might be happening, but God does, because he looks at our lives from the vantage points of heaven. And so when you make decisions and you play God, what happens is you take people's lives into your hands. Now, in this particular season, in this particular thing that happens is that ultimately, Abraham and Sarah, they kind of mess everything up, right? Abraham has a wife with his handmaiden, with his wife's handmaiden, with her maid, and his name is Ishmael. Ishmael ultimately becomes the father of what we know today as the modern movement of Islam, where Jacob becomes the branch of Judaism and then ultimately Christianity. And the two have been at war with each other since this moment in time, when a person who didn't realize that when you get ahead of what God's plans are, oftentimes the troops can mistake you for the enemy. When you take the things that God is in control of and you try to control them yourselves, because things aren't working the way you wanted them to, because the grass isn't as green as you hoped it would be, because the passive member of your relationship needs to step up and make it happen. The problem is, in those faithless seasons, you take matters into your own hands and you start to play God. And then what happens is generationally, right, you can set into motion things that were never meant to be set into motion. I want you to think about all the issues that our world faces today. It's possible that none of that would have been taken, would have happened, would have been possible, would have even happened at all if Abraham and Sarah would have just been faithful. And they're both, guilty of getting ahead of God and taking matters into their own hands. Where is it that you're taking matters into your own hands? Where is it that you're getting ahead of God's plans and purpose for your life? Maybe it's because you want to pretend that you're somebody that you're not, or you're not getting what you want as fast as you think you should be getting it, and so you take matters in your own hands. And what are you willing to do to make yourself happy, because you can change what's happening, instead of learning to be content because of Christ's presence in your life? And Abraham and Sarah, they kind of mess everything up. It's not just that you fall victim to fear in these faithless seasons, or that you get ahead of God, but you stop believing that God will do what he said he will do. God said he was going to make him the father of many nations. This was the initial promise that God gave him. He said, I'm not only going to bless you with a large family, a lineage to be remembered, but you're going to become a blessing to others. And they took matters in their own hands because God's timing wasn't moving fast enough for their timing. Well, we're getting old and God hasn't fulfilled his promise. Well, let me tell you something. Senior citizens, listen to me right now. You think that your time is up, that your time is past, that your time is just beginning. God can work in the lives of senior citizens just like he can in the lives of 19, 20, 25-year-olds. God is not done with you, and he has plans and purposes for you. And so don't give up on the calling that God has for you right now just because you are old. What happens in verse 17, if you look at chapter 17, verse 17, it says, Abraham fell down on his face and he laughed and said to himself, how is it possible that a son be born to a man that's 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? My wife's 90, I'm 100. He fell down laughing when God said he was going to give him a son. You got ahead of me. I'm going to give you a son. There's no way this is going to happen. There's no way. And so he's already got his maidservant pregnant. He's already got Ishmael, and this is already happening. And Sarah laughs to herself in chapter 18, verses 12 through 14. At the very thought, she says, after all, I'm worn out and my master is old. How now will I have this pleasure? Even if I could give birth now at 90 years old, why would I want to? She says. No way. Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, I will not have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for God? Remember what he calls you to. Remember what he promises you. Remember the purposes he has for you aren't just about your life in the here and now. It's not your 88, 90, 100 years on this planet, but the legacy that you will leave behind by the way that you lead your family. See, we have such small thinking with our lives that we think that what we do is just about us and just about the here and now. But God's promise to Abraham was that he would have a legacy. God's promise to you is that he will give you a legacy and he will use your legacy. But if you take your legacy in your own hands and you don't lay it at the feet of Jesus, if you don't allow the Holy Spirit to work in and through you, then your legacy is limited by what you are able to accomplish. Abraham and Sarah, they tried it on their own, and look what happens. Now a whole world of people across the globe are at war with each other because of these two major religions that are at war with each other. And we can fool ourselves and pretend like we can all get along, but the truth of the matter is that when we take lives in our matters in our own hands, we make a problem for generations to come. I mean, this is happening in modern day economy, right? We're, we don't know what to do, and so we're giving stimulus checks to everybody and their brother. Somebody's going to have to pay for those, our kids, our grandkids, our great-great-great-great-grandkids. Somebody's going to have to pay for all of this. But we're worried about the now. And I get it that it's about survival. It's about just surviving. We can't thrive unless we survive. I get it. But we don't always think it all the way through to the very, very end now, do we? That'll be a problem for someone else some other day. But it might be a problem that's so big that someone else won't be able to overcome it. Faithless seasons, instead of remaining faithful in tough situations, sometimes just defer the problems to be someone else's problems. And I don't know about you, but I'm not comfortable with just making problems for my grandchildren and their grandchildren. I want the legacy of my life to be the legacy like Abraham, where our name is great and that God's name is made great through us. And that not only does he bless us, but I'm a blessing. But that only happens when we're faithful. Faithful to God in our situations, faithful to God in our circumstances. And so sometimes it's hard, even in those faithless situations. But let me give you the good news. Because a lot of us are in a faithless season right now. Let me give you the good news. That even though we go through seasons of faithlessness, that God's redemptive power, if we allow him to work in and through us, we will be remembered as faithful. There are two places in the New Testament that Abraham is mentioned. And, there's more than two, but two that I want to bring to your attention today. And that is in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and he went, even though he did not know where he was going. He was faithful, and he will be remembered as faithful. Also in Romans chapter 4, verse 19 through 21, it says, without weakening his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead. And since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead, yet he did not waver through his unbelief regarding the promise of God. And he was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he promised. Notice that the memory of our misdeeds is quickly forgotten when we lean into our faithfulness to God and let Him finish the story. You may have chapters in your story that are broken, that are jacked up, but I'm going to tell you something right now. It is not too late for you to lean into God. You may have chapters of your story where you took matters into your own hands and you wound up with your very own Ishmael, but God is telling you that He's going to give you a new calling, a new purpose, and it's going to fulfill what He originally had planned for you, even though you've messed it up in the here and now. But you got to lean back in to the faith that you once had. You got to lean back into the obedience that you once had. You got to lean back into the situation, the circumstances that God has in store for you. And it's less about what's happening around you and more about you learning to be content in all the circumstances, because you know something, that God's got your back. And even though you're 100, and even though metaphorically your wife is 90, and it says that her uterus is dead, that He's still going to give you the plans and purposes that He promised for you. But it only happens when we lean back into the faithfulness of being His children. In this series, we've looked at a few different things, but we've looked at what it looks like as a husband and a wife, as a partnership, to put God in the center. What happens when you don't, and what happens when you do. And I hope for you that your relationship goals wouldn't be that you'd have cutesy little Instagram pictures together, or be that old couple in the garden together, but that your relationship goals would be that you would simply be the couple that was faithful through the good times and the bad, that you placed God in the center of your relationship, and even though you weathered storms, you weathered them, and that you didn't just go through hard times, but you grew closer together through those hard times in Jesus' name. I hope that's your relationship goals. It's been fun hanging out with you and teaching on this topic and being together as we've learned about what God's plans and purposes are for us in our marriage relationships. And I pray that you've been blessed by this. I can't wait to talk to you again, and we'll see you guys real soon.